Welcome to Big Daddy Storytime. We're reading John Henry. Who was John Henry? Well, folks say that the day John Henry was born, the wind howled and the storm clouds gathered so thick that they were pushing each other for space in the sky. People say it was as if the storm was trying to give its power to that little baby. This baby, something special, John Henry's mama yelled over the booming thunder. Every baby's something special, his pa yelled back. He fussed over John Henry the way folks always fuss over a baby. Suddenly, little John Henry grasped the hammer hanging from his papa's belt. Jumpin' Jehoshaphat, Pa laughed. This baby was born with a hammer in his hand. As a young boy, John Henry learned how to plow fields, pick cotton, but what he really loved to do was hammer with his papa's old hammer. Why, folks say that he'd pluck lightning bolts from the sky and hammer them straight just for practice. One fine morning, John Henry packed up his hammer. Ma, Pa, he said, it's time I saw the world. He kissed them goodbye and headed down the road. His ma called him back because he'd forgotten his handkerchief. After that, John Henry never took it off because it reminded him of her. John Henry walked and walked until he found a farmer who needed some help. He dug a 30 feet deep well, put a barn up, and built 12 tiny chicken houses on account that the chickens each wanted their own house. That was in the morning. He spent the afternoon rescuing a young girl's cat from a tree. The trouble was, the cat didn't want to be rescued. Every time John Henry got close, it'd scurry up to the higher and skinnier branches, but he caught it in the end. John Henry tromped all over the country. Wherever he reached a farm or a town, he'd stop and ask if anyone needed some work to be done. Depending on the season, John Henry would plow and plant or hoe and weed. He'd fix tools and do other blacksmith work. He helped farmers bring their crops at harvest. Whenever he worked, folks fed him and gave him a place to lay his head at night. John Henry enjoyed meeting all different kinds of folks and doing all different kinds of work. But always, the work he loved best was hammering. As he fixed a farmer's plow or pounded a cartwheel into shape, he'd sing, I was born with a hammer in my hand. Oh, yes, I was born with a hammer in my hand. John Henry was traveling to another town when he spied a wagon stuck in mud. The woman tried to pull it out was just a tiny bitty thing. You're too little to pull that wagon loose, John Henry said. How else am I going to get it out of this mud? The woman asked. You're big and strong, but I don't see you using those muscles. John Henry grabbed the wagon and drug it from the mud. Thank you, said the woman. She held out her hand. I'm Lucy Ann. They talked a bit. Lucy Ann wasn't afraid to speak her mind, and she was mighty pretty. John Henry decided that maybe it was time for him to settle down and get married. He took a job near Lucy Ann's house, working for a railroad. He'd hammer all day, busting boulders into gravel for the railroad bed. And as he swung his hammer, John Henry would sing, I was born with a hammer in my hand. Oh, yes, I was born with a hammer in my hand. One day, the foreman called the workers together. The crew over by Big Ben was laying track to the mountain. He said, but they need help opening the tunnel through the mountains. You'll be paid twice as much as the crew does. You'll be driving steel spikes through solid rock, the foreman explained. You've got to be as strong as an ox to drive these spikes straight. You can count on me, John Henry said. John Henry told Lucienne about the tunnel that night. I was born to build that tunnel, John Henry said. Lucienne, I've got to go. Of course you do, Lucienne said. And I'll go with you. My aunt and uncle live in that part of the country. They're getting old and could use my help on the farm. We can stay with them. John Henry went to Big Ben and followed the train tracks until he found the working crew. I'm John Henry. I've come to drive steel, he said. John Henry? Huh? I've heard of you, said the Big Ben foreman. You bust boulders fine enough, but can you drive a spike into rock? Sure, said John Henry. Which one of you shakers is going to hold that spike for me? The crew stared at John Henry's muscles and shook their heads. They were afraid that if John Henry missed the spike, his hammer would flatten the hand that held it for him. Finally, a small brave man named Little Bull put a spike in place. Whoosh went John Henry's hammer. Clink went the spike. Hooray went the crew. It went in with one stroke, said the foreman. You're hired. That summer was hot and drier than a mouthful of sand. Most crews worked as slow as snails, but not the Big Ben's crew. That's because John Henry drove spikes twice as fast as anyone else. And as he hammered, he'd sing, I was born with a hammer in my hand. Oh, yes, I was born with a hammer in my hand. Everything was going okay until one day when a salesman brought a new a machine to the crew. This steam drill can drive spikes faster than anyone, he said. Not faster than John Henry, said the foreman. I challenge your man to a contest, said the salesman. If the machine wins, you buy it. But if John Henry wins, I'll give it to you. I'll do it, said John Henry. But if I win, the men keep their jobs. John Henry talked it over with Lucienne that night. I'm worried, said John Henry admitted. I don't know if I can beat a machine, but if I don't, we all lose our jobs. You can only try your best, said Louisiana. Remember, you were born with a hammer in your hand, John Henry. You were born with a hammer in your hand. The sun was shining so hot the day of the contest that hens were laying hard-boiled eggs. John Henry and Little Bull got their spikes ready. The salesman rolled the steam drill into position. He filled the boiler with water and stoked the fire. Then he fussed and fiddled, pulling levers and pushing buttons. The drill was sputtering and coughing up a bunch of black smoke and started clunking away. Start driving, yelled the foreman. Whoosh, cling went John Henry's hammer. Tut, 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 tut went the steam drill. The steam drill is ahead, cried one man. No, John Henry is ahead, yelled another. At the end of the first hour, John Henry was sweating so much that his hammer kept sliding out of his hands. The steam drill clunked along, but the black smoke it spat out was getting thicker. It's ahead of us, said John Henry to Little Bull. We'll catch it, said Little Bull. John Henry picked up his hammer. Whoosh, clink. That's it, cried Little Bull. We can catch it. But by the end of the second hour, everyone could see that the steam drill was still ahead. The crew was nervous. No one drives steel better than John Henry, Louisiana said. If he can't beat the machine, no one can. And it sure looked like no one could beat that machine. Black smoke was pouring out of it by the end of the third hour. But it didn't show any sign of slowing down. I can't let the crew down, yelled John Henry. I've got to go faster. Little Bull, get me a second hammer. Well, John Henry set both his arms a-swinging. And that helped some. By the end of the fourth hour, John Henry was gaining on the steam drill. But he and Little Bull were still behind. Whoosh, cling, whoosh, cling went John Henry's hammer. Tat, 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 tat went the steam drill. I've never seen a man use two hammers before, cried one man. John Henry is no ordinary man, said Louisiana. At the end of the fifth hour, the sun was shining straight overhead. Folks were eating picnic lunches and taking naps in the shade. But John Henry and the steam drill kept right on going. By the sixth hour of the contest, John Henry was plumb tuckered out. Worse, the steam drill was still ahead. So John Henry thought about how much he and the men needed their jobs. He thought about how everyone believed in him. He was starting hammering and swinging his hammer faster, keeping time with the music. Tut, 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 went the steam drill. He's almost catching the machine, yelled someone. Go, John Henry, go, cheered the crowd. John Henry didn't hear the crowd or the steam drill. All he heard was the song he was humming. I was born with a hammer in my hand. Oh yes, I was born with a hammer in my hand. When John Henry passed the machine, the crowd whooped and hollered, something furious. Suddenly, the steam drill started to sputter. Something exploded, and there was a huge cloud of black smoke. The salesman ran for a bucket of water. Whoosh, cling, whoosh, cling went John Henry's hammer. He kept right on going, even though the machine had stopped. The salesman dumped bucket after bucket of water on the steam drill, trying to cool it off so that it would start again. All that time, John Henry never stopped. Whoosh, cling, whoosh, cling. Finally, after 2 hours, the steam drill started. John Henry was a good 5 feet ahead, and there was only 1 hour left in the contest. Time's up, yelled the foreman. John Henry dropped right where he stood. The foreman measured the hole that John Henry dug. He measured the hole that the steam drill had dug. The steam drill went 9 feet into the mountain, he said. Now, that's pretty impressive. But John Henry, the foreman looked around and smiled. John Henry dug 15 feet. Folks threw their hats into the air and cheered. John Henry never heard the cheers. He had hammered so hard and so fast that his heart burst in his chest. They buried John Henry on the hill overlooking the tunnel that he helped to dig. Folks say that if you listen closely, you can hear the wind whistling. I was born with a hammer in my hand. Oh, yes, I was born with a hammer in my hand. This is this a true story? Some of it is. The tunnel is real, although it isn't used anymore. It was built in West Virginia in 1870. That time, it was the longest tunnel in the world. The steam drill was first used around this time as well, and it was quite possible that there was a former slave named John Henry who worked on building the railroad. But the competition and other feats that the folks say happened are probably just part of the legend that surrounds John Henry. So what we could take away from this, my friends, is this: even if the story is kind of like what they're saying, somewhat exaggerated, it does teach us one thing: that it's possible if you put your all in, my friends, you too could be like John Henry and make a difference. John Henry helped his crew, and he was determined that he wouldn't let that steam drill beat him, and he beat it. I know you can, and I know you're determined as well. So whatever you put your mind to, you can do. Okay, come back for more more movies on Big Daddy Storytime, and I will see you next time. Be blessed. Bye bye for now.